Morning, everyone, and welcome to getIT episode. I think it's 9 for 2020. And I'm very privileged this morning to have Erin Casteel with me. And we're going to chat about something that she's passionate about, and so am I. This issue of how do you get an organization right to work in an environment that has changed quite a lot, I think, in the last few years. Um, so, Erin, if you can maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself. Where do you come from? I bumped into you in the idle community. So, as I suppose currently you're the most well known for being the lead architect of ITIL 4. So, how did you get here? Uh,
Oh, goodness
where did you
gracious.
come from?
Well, um, I'll start where I am right now. I'm in Sydney, Australia right now. It
Hmm.
is five in the afternoon here, but you and I have the fact that it's autumn for both of us in common, even
Yeah.
if we're on opposite sides of the world. You can probably hear from my accent that I don't have an Australian accent, even though I've lived here for since 1998. Um, but gosh, how did I start here and how did I get to here? I was working in the software industry in the US for a number of years. I through that got interested in service management because I was helping to implement support solutions for different countries in Latin America. I ended up moving to Australia because I married an Australian. That's how I moved here. Ended up meeting some ITIL consultants who asked me, "So what do you do?" And I told them about my adventures in Latin America, and they said, "Hey, that's the same stuff we do." So I ended up becoming an ITIL consultant and trainer right at the end of ITIL version 1, beginning of ITIL version 2. So I trained thousands of people in a couple of versions of ITIL and um, did lots of consulting. And over time, that expanded because I got increasingly involved with management systems and management system standards. As you can imagine, that sort of is a pretty normal progression, I suppose. Got involved working with ISO on the development of management system standards starting in 2006. And I'm still doing that, still very deeply involved in that. And then I was a reviewer for ITIL 2011 and then became a lead architect of ITIL 4.
Okay,
And
cool.
so there you go. Probably too much detail there, but well.
Okay, so yeah, like me, I think um, my first ITIL course was ITIL version 1.
Right.
So,
Well, another
so
thing that you and I have in common. There you go.
yeah, so
Right.
yeah, but that was only foundation though.
Me
My
too.
managers was was version
Right.
2, and I must admit, of all the badges that I'm most proud to wear, it's still my original red badge.
There you go.
Now, anyway.
There you go.
So, today we're going to talk a little bit about architecting um, a business to be able to function in this topsy turvy world that we live in.
Oh,
Um,
topsy-turvy. I love that. That's such a great way to describe it.
yeah, it's a very British thing to say, also. I think, very.
Right.
So,
No, it's
and
good.
another thing that we've got in common, we both live in old colonies here.
Me too.
Yeah. So,
Southern Hemisphere colonies of the UK. There you go.
yeah. So, what? Okay, so let's sort of set the scene to the listeners first. Everybody's talking about digital transformation. Everybody is throwing tons of money at things and getting very little results.
Right.
Um, And it reminds me of in the late 90s when everybody was doing business process reengineering,
Right.
that most of these initiatives basically failed. Um,
Yep.
and what was interesting for me is that Michael Hammett said that just because you call something business process reengineering doesn't mean it is business process reengineering. And
Yep.
most of those initiatives that failed was because it wasn't that. It was IT service providers selling the same stuff to people with a new label,
Cookie cutter.
promising them that it would,
Right.
would change the world. So
Yes. So
these
let's
initiatives,
give it a bit of, yeah, so let's give it a bit of context, because I think what we need to do is to talk about what we're really talking about. And that is, this is evolution and it's a new paradigm completely, right?
yeah,
So throughout the 20th century, as you know, organizations were evolving to work as efficiently and effectively. In fact, those two words, I remember those from Mitel version 1, you probably do as well. So efficiently and effectively, within the paradigm that existed at that point in time, which was essentially based on manufacturing, right? So the term that you would use for a mature organization was, it's a well-oiled machine, right?
yes,
And this was what people were aspiring to. So that business process reengineering that you're describing was about another attempt to help organizations with that well-oiled machine. That was the purpose of those business process reengineering efforts.
yeah,
So what's happened is we're in a new paradigm completely. That paradigm is over. And if you live in the ocean, you'll either grow gills and fins or you're not going to last long, basically. So, what we know from Darwin is that when the paradigm changes, the species either adapt or they die and they get replaced. And what we're now dealing with in terms of organizations needing to adapt, um, they either will or they won't, right?
yeah,
And it's very, very difficult. And in some cases, as with Darwin, some species are better able to do that than others. So, for some reason, off the top of my head, I'm thinking about the moths. There were these white moths during Victorian England who changed color to be soot colored because everything was covered in soot. And if they were white, then the birds would eat them. But if they were sooty, then they were able to adapt to not be visible,
hmm,
right? So we're now at this point where organizations will either adapt or and they will thrive or they won't.
yeah,
So that's where we're at. Um, just as an aside, one thing that I think about a lot at the moment is that Gen Z, as we call them, are far better able to adapt to this new paradigm than our generation because they were raised in it. So it's natural for them. That's like they were already raised in the water. They've already got the gills, right?
yeah,
So the sooner we can hand over to them, probably the better off for all of us. Um, but the other thing that I want to say, because people are always focused on how difficult it is and how challenging, and all of that is true. But there's another piece of this that I think really needs to be emphasized, and that is that uncertainty and diversity are necessary to life,
mm,
right? And
that is true.
we have to keep focused on that. So I guess the next thing that we need to do in terms of setting some context is, okay, what do we mean by an agile and a resilient organization? What does that look like?
Yeah, yeah,
And why do we care about that? So what we mean, I'm using the royal we, and hopefully you agree with me, and if you don't, you could tell me, um, is So an agile and resilient organization is able to successfully navigate volatility and uncertainty and continually adapt very quickly to relentless change. And this isn't temporary, it's a permanent state of being. That's another big piece of it, that people think,
Mhm.
oh, I just have to kind of get through. So when you're talking about these organizations that are failing at their transformation, sometimes their expectation is, oh, we just have to get ourselves through this digital transformation and then we'll be done. And no,
Yeah.
actually, this is a permanent thing. The ultimate goal is actually anti-fragility, right? So where the organization is able to thrive in this condition of radical uncertainty, um, and the unknowable future. And that is possible. And the reason this I have this focus on architecture as a piece of that is because it it, it is a way of making it tangible for
Okay.
people and for organizations, as opposed to, oh, we're just going to sort of do this transition. So one other thought that I have is around, just going back to my point about uncertainty and diversity being necessary to life, just to sort of emphasize that these disruptive forces that we're all living and breathing, and increasingly so, um, if they're managed well, they can and will make an organization stronger. And a really good analogy that I read recently was this idea about how trees grow, and the fact that wind is very important to the growth of trees, because the presence of the wind is making the tree stronger by keeping the tree moving all the time. And this
Mm.
causes stress in the wood, and it um, causes the tree to grow something that's actually called stress wood. And it helps the tree to grow stronger and position itself so that it can thrive. A tree that doesn't have that kind of stress doesn't get the strength and won't thrive, interestingly enough. So I want to
Yeah.
use an example of, you know, why we shouldn't necessarily be uh, afraid
Yeah.
of the volatile and uncertain and complex and ambiguous world that we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
Why we need to actually embrace that, and we need to learn to thrive.
Yeah.
And there
So
are ways that we can make that happen.
yeah.
Anyway,
So what's
context. That was
interesting is that you use the evolution um, metaphor for this conversation. What most people don't know is, to my mind, one of the two greatest statesmen that ever came out of South Africa was a gentleman by the name of Jan Christian Smuts. Um, he was also a founder of the League of Nations, and the only South African that was British Prime Minister, although it was only for 2 days while Churchill was at Yalta.
wow.
Um,
I didn't know
yeah,
that.
yeah, and he wrote
Wow.
a book that was called Holism and Evolution, and he said, yes, species who are able to change uh, survives, but what's actually more important for survival is diversity. Um,
Right.
and that's also something that now comes into this whole new age of being, is um, we don't have something fixed. It's interesting that you say that you're into to management systems, but management systems needs to be very, very fluid today for people
That's right.
to
100%.
thrive.
Right. And
Um,
that is actually how the value system came about, right?
okay.
The idea was an organizational system. So if you sort of boil down what is essential for any organizational system, like what needs to be there in order for it to function, um, you end up with governance, continual improvement, and flow of value. That's, in a fundamental sense, what an organizational system needs, right? So
Okay.
with that being the foundation, with the understanding that an organization um, is always going to be driven by its own context, by where it is and where it wants and needs to go. That middle part, that center, is actually very fluid. And while the ITIL 4 service value system has that service value chain in the middle, you can actually put different value chains in there, right? You can either replace it, or you can actually have multiple value chains in that centerpiece. And the way that I've always visualized it is that you've kind of got this stability on the outside and this fluidity in the inside
Mm.
that is always facilitating that flow. So that is
So,
exactly how I've sort of visualized what that new paradigm version of an organizational system needs to be in order
yeah.
to facilitate the kinds of things that we're talking about. Exactly.
Yeah. So the when people talk, I think when most people think about a management system or whatever, they want it to be finite, but it can't be. Um, I suppose heuristics is actually a better way of having that system than having something finite. And the same goes for governance. Um, I wish I can find the person who first used the words governance, risk, and control in the same sentence, because I would like to throw them off a building. Because everybody just thinks about risk and control, and they forget that governance is actually about the leadership of the organization, making sure that the organization fulfills its purpose. Yeah.
Right.
And
It's
and
there to fulfill the objectives. So it's about steering the ship. It's about,
yeah,
you know, having oversight, and just making sure that you're, helping to facilitate the direction. That can
yeah,
be through servant leadership. That can be through, you know, the um, kinds of guardrails that you put in place, which don't have to be, um, you know, sort of old fashioned. Well, no,
rigid and finite.
right. In
Yeah,
fact, today can't be. So you still need to have some of that. You need to sort of ensure that for certain aspects of what you're doing, that there is clarity and that there is consistency, and you need to have policies and controls in place. So a perfect example is the organization's cybersecurity.
hmm,
You need to have controls in place that work well, that help to protect the organization's information,
but
right?
not too
So,
much, because it may
well,
stifle the opportunity for the organization to change in direction and grow and innovate also.
but so here's the cool thing about your organizational system is that you're constantly checking and adapting. You don't just put anything in place and then leave it there for eternity. You're always checking to see, is it working? Is it doing what we need for it to do? Do we need something different? Do we need to change this thing? That is what an organizational system that is healthy
Mm.
is doing. So
It's
so it isn't right.
it's interesting that you use cybersecurity as a reference, because to in my experience, um, those are the guys that absolutely loves Control C, Control V, um, and there's this ton of controls that's in place that's actually meaningless. I think
Well,
in one of the
I don't necessarily
publications that
think.
we shared an article in, is one of my arguments was that at least more than 50% of controls in organizations shouldn't be there, either because they were copy and pasted, and assuming that what made somebody else safe is going to make me safe is not right. And number two is they can't be measured and evaluated. So what's the point?
Can I just speak to that quickly because I have a
Hmm.
different opinion? So, so I think, well, I agree with you, but I just want to sort of qualify that because a lot of organizations don't necessarily realize that the intent. So, if we talk about ISO 27001, right?
Hmm.
ISO 27001 has Annex A at the back that has a whole list of standard controls, right? And what organizations are supposed to do with Annex A is they're supposed to do a risk assessment and they're supposed to say, um, what are our actual risks? And then what you do is you look through Annex A and you're doing that to see, have we missed anything? Have we forgotten anything? You shouldn't actually have any controls. And 27001 doesn't mandate that you use any of those. It has to be based on your risk assessment, right?
No,
But what
absolutely.
organizations do is they do it completely backwards for exactly what
Mm.
you were saying. They start with Annex A, they just sort of apply the lot, and then they reverse engineer it um, backwards. Now, in
Yeah.
some cases, since really the vast majority of those controls are very basic, um, that's actually okay. However, it isn't how it's supposed to work. It is actually intended to be um, managed, front to back as opposed to
Mm.
back to front. But anyway,
So
that
what I
was a
what
little.
I normally do when I get involved in 27,000 projects, the first thing that I say to the guys, wonderful, you give me this lot of shelfware, but for each one of the controls, please tell me how does it or to which risk does it relate? Okay, and
And
once
there
you've
and it
done
should be
that,
absolutely right.
once you've done that,
Right.
I want you to tell me how each one of your risks relates to your objectives. And then they go,
100%.
what? And I say, okay, but that's where you were actually supposed to start, was with the objectives, and then say, okay. I mean, I love ISO's definition of risk, and I'm gonna paraphrase it now. A risk is anything that stops you from achieving your objectives. Go and look at the definition, and you can
Oh,
paraphrase
don't
it
trust
as
me. I live
that.
and breathe. Yes. You have no idea. Well, you actually do know to what degree that has been one of the most contentious um, conversations that's been going on for years. But
Hmm.
so, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
So just okay. Let's change direction slightly. I'd
yeah, because
sometimes say to
I want to keep
people,
talking about our topic.
yeah, I want I sometimes say to people they should read Frederick Laloux and not Frederick Taylor. So take that
I would
conversation
agree with
further.
that 100%. 100%. Yeah. Yes. I'm yeah. Couldn't agree
so
more with any of that. Okay, so where were we in this
so so so
exploration around
this
around
change
agile and
paradigm.
resilient organizations? Because I
y-
want to try to get through some of this
Yeah,
so that we can give people something tangible out of
yeah.
this, right? So I think I think it's maybe a good idea. I always believe in examples. It's a good idea to give examples and examples that people know that they are seeing and hearing. So
Hmm.
when we think about what agility and resilience looks like, it's important to say This doesn't just apply to some organizations, it applies to all organizations, all sizes, all industry sectors. So there's a couple of examples that I can think of, and one is in the news, front page of the news nonstop these days, and that's Ukraine.
Mhm.
Because I mean, I'm not an expert, but like a lot of us have been reading a lot of news articles about this, of course. And from what I understand, after Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, Ukraine made the decision to completely rebuild its military and change their structure from a very sort of top-down command and control model to a much more agile model with a lot more decision making happening at lower levels and a lot of adding a lot of different capabilities than they had had previously. And between that point, between 2014 and now, they've been working on that continuously. And that's really important to for an organization thinking about this to appreciate, because this is not something that's going to happen overnight. This is something that is going to need to build and evolve over time, but you have to sort of start in the direction and you have to keep making conscious decisions to keep going in the direction, which is something that um, that they obviously have done, as you can see from some of the outcomes that they've had, right? I mean, obviously
Mm.
it's been horrible, um, but the the effort and um, the practices over a period of time have allowed them to have a much different um, result than a lot of people globally would have expected.
Yeah.
Anyway, another example, much more close to home. So here in Sydney, and of course, everybody uses the pandemic, but it's quite a good example. But during lockdowns, of course, there were a lot of specifically restaurants and cafes that closed down, and many of them never reopened. And that's not specific to Sydney. That's something that, has happened all over the world. But there were some that started doing different things. So they started selling coffee or food or even cocktails for takeaway or for delivery. And these were restaurants or cafes that hadn't necessarily done that before, or they had only
Mhm.
done that as maybe a minor part of their business, but they completely transformed their business in some cases um, really quickly and started um, new business models, new products and services. And it was this really interesting thing where you saw there were some organizations that were managing to adapt really quickly. Um, Another example was, so we have large supermarkets that will deliver, and that had been in place already. They already had those capabilities. But what I started noticing was much smaller, like delicatessens and um, other shops started offering those kinds of things. And the interesting thing is, of course, we no longer have lockdown in Sydney, thank goodness, at the moment at least. But a lot of those organizations have retained some of those new products and services that they developed because they became really popular.
Mm.
And where some you hear say, oh, we're just so looking forward to being able to go back to normal, there are others that are just embracing this is actually this is actually good. We've actually learned things and we've grown
Mm.
and our organization has benefited. I mean, in some cases it's just a matter of sheer survival. But it's been fascinating to watch that. And this is just, in my local neighborhood with
Yeah.
the local shops around the corner kind of thing, right?
So
Um there are nonstop things, cyber attacks, supply chain issues. This isn't this
Yeah,
kind of thing where, oh, it's all over now. We can go back to how things
yeah.
were. It,
Uh,
it's not
And I
going to
think
happen.
that's the important thing. There is no new normal.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and what's interesting for me is if you look at the surveys that's being done, nobody wants to go back to the office all of the time. Yeah.
Right.
Um, Nobody wants command and control anymore. So I mean, I had an interesting conversation with um, David the other day about of Mike about the Great Quit. Yeah, Mike
Right.
Barrows. Um,
Right.
yeah, and that's also people within this context saying that no, if you want to treat us in the old way, we won't. Yeah, we're
Right.
not going
Right.
to. Yeah. So
And
here's the question.
that's important. That's a huge thing because one of the things that you one of the questions that you posed related to this discussion was about leaders, right?
Yeah.
And what can leaders do and what do leaders need to do? And one of the questions that we have to ask is how do we, because leaders can themselves be many times the most reluctant to make these kinds of changes because they see it as threatening to them personally, their career, their power, their, livelihood. How do we help them? Because I think that so much of this, the success for an organization rests on the leader being able to not just get it, but to embrace it.
Mm,
How do we help them to not either try to slow walk this because some of them will sort of talk the talk. They'll say, "Oh yeah, we want to join this new paradigm. We want to transform." But aren't necessarily acting like that's true.
yeah.
Um, i- in other cases, it's really even if they get it, they don't necessarily know what needs to be done. What do we actually do? But
Mm,
I think that your point about the fact that the workers do have a say, and the workers are actually helping to steer the ship
mm,
in this direction is really important.
yeah. And also this distinction maybe that's becoming more and more important between management and leadership. And my personal
Right.
feeling is that management is becoming less important and leadership is becoming more important. But you don't have to be
Absolutely.
in a position of power to be a leader.
100%. And that is one of the hugest lessons I think that has been learned over the past couple of years in ways that I mean, these were things that we already knew, but it has become so blatant.
Mm,
I mean, we've been through a lot of pain and hardship, but we've learned a lot of things. And all of that is incredibly valuable and actually quite exciting, I think. So, yeah.
yeah.
Um,
So you've got a high change tolerance, obviously, like me. So I suffer from attention deficit. So for me, change is not a problem. It's really cool because I can't concentrate on this stuff in any case long enough.
I like I like for things to be interesting and to always have to try to figure out how do we solve this new set of problems and how do we
Mm,
get people to work together better and how do we bring more joy into what we're
yeah.
doing, you know? So I've been seeing a lot of opportunities, but
Mm,
I think, we also have to really acknowledge this is very scary, very, very scary for a number of organizations.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of misunderstandings too. So
Mm,
a lot of people think that when we talk about an agile and resilient organization, that we somehow mean that there aren't any more rules and that everything is now going to be done in an ad hoc way, which is
mm,
interesting. But I've had these conversations, so I know that people think this. Um, and what we need to emphasize, because it's not just scary, it's also a non-starter for some organizations, particularly ones that work in very highly regulated um, industries, right? So what we have to try to help them understand is that it isn't about no constraints. It's about making sure that we have the right kind of constraints for um, the context, rather than one size fits all for everything. Per what you were talking about before with, um, you know, the the desire for that sort of rigid and predetermined system as opposed to the fluid system.
yeah.
Fluid doesn't mean no constraints. It means the right kind of constraints for the right kind of context. So as I said before, you will still have, in some cases, um, as needed policies and controls, but then there are other kinds of constraints that are called enabling constraints. And enabling constraints are different because they are there to help facilitate um, this ability to be highly adaptive, right? So, what that looks like would be a very um, diverse team with very different skill sets working together and solving problems utilizing all the different skill sets and perspectives of that diverse team, for example, as just um,
Mm,
one example. Another is around cadence. So in the past, you had the traditional 3 to 5 year strategic plan, right? So the top level of the organization this determines the strategic plan, and then you execute it for that next 3 to 5 year period. But we don't live in that paradigm anymore. So instead of that sort of annual or every 3 year thing, um, the idea is much more frequent, um, um, different types of governance, different types of navigational aids
mm,
that can facilitate this, that are happening at much higher frequency because things are changing too fast for
yeah.
that old model, right? So it isn't that we're not doing it; it's that we're doing it at a different cadence, and we're doing it using um, different navigational aids than we have previously,
Yeah.
or we're adding new ones.
But I think what's also important is to couple with that is this issue of the level of decision making and where it takes place. That
100%.
if that we and I think for many senior people in organizations, that's a very, very difficult thing. Um, wanting to see the full plan, even though it never happens that way. Wanting to make decisions, especially if something goes wrong, and taking those decisions further away from the person with the real skills to actually be able to make a better call.
Right,
Um, and this whole issue of uh, and you've got an idle for also just enough. Um, yeah.
right.
At each one of these levels, and I mean that's an old lean principle. In fact, I mean, um,
It is.
you do what you do when you need to do it, and not before. Because if you do it before, it's most probably the wrong decision because you don't know.
And the thing is, so when we talk about these navigational aids, the fact that the way that we do strategy and the way that we manage risk, that old model um, needs to be sort of blasted apart because you know the way that the vast majority of organizations are managing risk is again this very sort of traditional only dealing with known risks, right? And they do those very well. That's that can be very mature, but then there's all these other risks, and we can't apply um, solutions to a risk exactly as you say that we don't know enough about. Instead, we're kind of feeling around in the dark. We're basically having to it's like we're blindfolded and we have to have all of our senses working in this sort of um, hyper alert way. So we're feeling along the ground to see how stable the ground is around us and trying to hear for noises to try to figure out where we are. And the kind of mechanisms that we can leverage to help make better decisions um, need to, as a starting point, just acknowledge that that's something that we need to do as opposed to just relying on the old standby of let's do the old risk workshop where we go through the status of all of the risks we already identified 4 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's about adding. And one of the
Yeah.
things, that I'm a big fan of Kinevin, but one of the other things that I think is so um, fantastic that Dave Snowden, among others, has helped to articulate is around this idea of the distributed human sensor networks. So having a lot of people, and again, diversity, we're coming back to diversity,
Mm.
lots and lots of people who are all providing real-time input into what's happening, what does it look like, from all these different perspectives, all these different angles, to help us be able to find our way in this new paradigm. The biggest thing that has come out of um, this kind of change for me is how much we need each other, and we need the fact that we all have such different perspectives
Yes.
in order for this to work at all.
Can I
That
quickly
is
interject? Hello,
sure.
Amit. I'm
Please.
not
Sorry, I'm
ignoring
talking
you.
too much.
I'm just
Sorry.
looking at comments coming through. I'm just saying hello,
Oh,
Amit. I'm not ignoring you. So this morning, for my normal audience, we started very early. So I suspect that most people will only listen to this later today. But nice to have you with us. Sorry, Erin.
no,
Um, uh,
please. It's nice to know that there's somebody out there. Hey, that's cool. That's pretty cool.
yeah. So, but there's also for me um, this need to understand that less is more. Um,
Explain.
that
I think I know what you mean, but tell me what you mean.
yeah, you talked about we doing traditional risk very well, but I think quite often, that cadence, that cascade that I talked about. If there's no connection, why do it at all? Yeah, and
Well,
that's another thing
actually,
that agility, you know, means is that
okay.
you focus on what you need to do.
But this is the thing. I see a lot of great stuff that organizations are doing, and in terms of how some organizations are managing risk, when it comes to those known risks, they're actually doing a really good job. And it is very important. It's not that managing those risks is something that we need to stop doing. there are ongoing things that need to be done. The risk treatment plan needs to be updated. There's a whole bunch of things that need to be managed over time. So I'm not in any way advocating or not acknowledging how important it is. It's just that it isn't everything, and and dealing with emerging risks and dealing with the unknown unknowns needs to be much more um, what we do, right? So
Yeah.
we've talked a little bit about how governance needs to evolve. We've talked a little bit about how risk needs to evolve, and I guess sort of the last one that I want to touch on, if I can, just quickly, is um, one of the biggest differences that I see between organizations that are able to adapt and thrive in the way that we're describing and ones that aren't is very much around how they deal with continual improvement. I see it as just the most fundamental difference. And so, on the one hand, um, I'll just give you again a couple of examples. I'll talk to an organization and I'll say, okay, so talk to me about continual improvement. How do you do it? What does it look like? And they'll say, all right, well, once or twice a year we get these 4 or 5 people in a room for an hour, and those people will look at the list of corrective actions from the corrective actions register, and they'll prioritize and they'll pick 2 or 3 of those, right? And we're
Yeah.
done. Right? So that's
Yeah.
one end, that's
And I'm
one end of the
smiling.
spectrum. Right. But then there's the other. I want to actually talk about the opposite end of the spectrum, because I see that too, and it's beautiful. So you see uh, a service desk, and okay, this is an example from the 1990s that I'm going to give, but I've actually seen
Okay.
it other times. You see a service desk. Every person working on the service desk, and it was actually a pretty large one, so it was like at least 50 people, was required on a weekly basis to identify 1 to 5 opportunities for improvement, just from their perspective, from their role, um, which were then prioritized and actioned. People would get credit for having come up with various ideas. Oh my goodness, what a thriving culture that was.
Mm.
And I've seen this in lots of other examples. A construction crew doing that,
Mm.
a pharmaceutical a team in a pharmaceutical company doing that.
Yeah.
That is everybody feeling like I am contributing, and they're just actively seeing the results of
Mm.
their efforts and their contributions, and it just continues to grow, and the benefits multiply exponentially. So
Yeah.
I have to mention that, because I did say at the beginning that for me, an organizational system in this paradigm has to have governance, continual improvement, and the flow of value. And I needed to sort of just close the loop on, why is that important? It's actually the lifeblood of the organizational system that that um, keeps the blood flowing, keeps the system alive,
Mm.
if it's done properly and not once a year for an hour,
Yeah.
right?
So, an interesting, I don't know, I at least think it's interesting because it's something that I see. I quite often say to people that don't think about agile as a project management methodology. It's actually a way of doing continual improvement.
Right.
And the cool thing that I like about most of the agile methods, so I'm a big Scrum fan. So how does a sprint end? By doing a retrospective, learning what you
Right.
can improve. Yeah.
Right. Just to sort of kind of close the loop on another thing that we talked about. We're talking about enabling constraints. Scrum is a
Mm-hmm.
perfect example of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are things that we have that we can utilize, that we can leverage, and should be leveraging all the time. I guess the last thing that I want to say in terms of providing, I don't know, I want to give some kind of um, practical tips or something,
Yeah.
is an organization doesn't have to think of this as this huge. So when I use the word paradigm, it sounds enormous, and it is, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen in small incremental steps over time, like any evolution. Evolution is
Yes.
something that happens incrementally.
Yeah.
So this concept of culture hacking, which I absolutely love, which is about making lots of little tweaks to, you're tweaking the organization in these tiny ways, but it can have these really interesting effects. So if what you're going for is to try, for example, to get the organization to be more customer focused, build that into people's how they work. So every presentation has to be focused on what is this from, in terms of the customer's perspective on this. We need to understand that in order to, be able to proceed with it. Or every meeting that you're having, try to build a couple of minutes at the beginning of, helping to kind of emphasize these things and getting everybody engaged in that.
Yeah.
Those are culture hacks, which again, they seem like these tiny little things, but they can be absolutely transformative. And it is it is a collection of a lot of different pieces of a puzzle, because we're dealing with complexity. The organization is a complex adaptive system, and it's in an ecosystem which is unbelievably complex. So there's lots and lots of pieces, but you have to start somewhere. And if you focus on a couple of these things that we've been talking about, adapting your strategy, opening up the way that you manage risk, really starting to think about how, um, to to leverage and get the most out of continual improvement, which is your lifeblood.
Mm.
And and what are all these little tiny tweaks that can be made relatively simply? And then, to your point about trying to push decision making down as far as possible in the organization and get as many people involved, you can have different levels. Again, this is an architecture thing. You decide what decisions can happen at what levels in the organization, and over time, you can push more things down further in the organization. It doesn't have to be
Mm.
this thing where you just overnight, um, change that, 180 degrees. It can be something where you start small and you keep moving more and more decisions down, over time, as
Yeah.
the
So
organization evolves.
I think there's two things that I would just want to comment in terms of this last little bit that you talked about. Number one, it's not only about devolving decision making, it's also about delaying decision making.
Did you say
Not
delaying?
making delaying, yes, not
Delaying.
making decisions based on assumptions,
Right.
but making decisions once you've got the real data. Yeah.
Or
Um,
making smaller decisions, making a
yeah.
decision that you can make, so that your decision is, I'm going to take one step to the left, I'm going to take one step forward, rather than, because
And
you only have that much information.
yeah, I'll defer the decision until it is really necessary. Um, instead of, yeah, because otherwise you make decisions based on what? Your gut feel?
Well,
your
Well, no,
perception,
you can
your
you should be making decisions based on these navigational aids, and that includes that human sensor network. So the decisions
mm,
you're making should be based on what you know and what you can know, and you can make decisions, just not necessarily monolithic ones, or you know, ones that are based on, exactly as you say, no data, or worse, the wrong data, because
the
that's a huge.
past.
Right, right.
Yeah, I mean that's very and then you talked about customer centricity as an example. I just want to leave this with people. If you want people to be customer centric, let them speak to customers. Um, yeah, stop
Essential.
building personas in a
Oh my
little
god.
corner of the organization.
Right.
That's all BS. Yeah, if you want to know what customers want and need,
Ask them. Right.
talk to them.
Exactly. It's pretty basic, isn't it? Hey,
Yeah, it's simple stuff. Yeah,
it
and
is.
and that's why entrepreneurial and new organizations tends to get this stuff right more often than not. Well, if it is a successful startup or an entrepreneurial organization, because they
Well,
do
it's
these
also
things.
easier, so when you're smaller, it's also easier to move and to adapt, because you haven't got this huge infrastructure that you've built that's based on an old model. So it is a lot easier, to be agile when you don't have all that legacy stuff that's, you know, making life a lot harder. So
So
you have to kind of appreciate,
yeah,
large
so
complex
it,
organizations have a hard time with this.
in one of your articles, you talk about the bimodal operation rating
Right,
model,
right,
um, and I think that was sort of an attempt to speak to this very issue. Yeah.
right.
Um, however, what we telling customers now is that they need to actively relook at their business model more often.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And you know when people hear architect, they think about a building that's going to stand for 100 years. That's not what we mean by architecting your business today.
That's correct. That is not at all what we mean. We're talking about something completely, it's a new kind of architecture, right? Again, no one person or very small group has all the answers. We need each other. We need to try to get as much diverse perspective as possible, and that architecture needs to be built not just to accommodate that, but to fully take advantage of the power that comes from that.
Yeah.
And one last thing,
Hmm.
and that is, again, just to emphasize that agility requires stability. And
Okay, that's
that sounds
interesting. Okay.
interesting, but this is
Yeah.
how I like to think about it. Say you're a gymnast, right?
Okay, I'm with you.
Genius can do a whole bunch of amazing things. They can just, you know, leap through the air, and they can do these incredible things, but they need to have some kind of stable surface to work against, right?
Mm,
Jackie Chan and Jet Li are legends and gods, but the amazing things that they do would not be possible without gravity and, a stable surface. So,
yeah.
when you are architecting, make sure that you're thinking about what parts can and need to move, and what kinds of um, parameters you can and should use to facilitate success.
Yeah.
It
And
isn't
if
it
you
isn't a blob, like even a cell has
yeah.
has a shape, right?
So interesting that you use Jackie Chan and Jet Li as examples.
because they're paragons. How can we not use them?
Yeah. By the way, that's why my fingers looks the way they do. Um,
Why? What? What?
and I
Because
used to
Jackie Chan.
do Chinese martial arts.
Did you
Um,
really?
yeah.
Oh,
So
so
when I
I did
was
as well.
much slimmer than I am now.
I did as well, and it was, I never got that good at it, but I did learn to appreciate certain things,
Yeah.
and one of them was the concept of the stance, and the
Yeah.
fact that if you are in that stance, which isn't a rigid stance, then no matter what's coming at you, you can deal with
Yeah.
it because you are
So
in your right. And that's what we're talking about with
yeah.
organizations.
So you need to practice to be agile.
Yes, every day.
You can't expect to be agile just because you read a book. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Uh, there's a lot of effort that goes into this beforehand. And
And
a lot
during
is about
and right. But
a lot
so
of it is about structure and recognizing patterns and being able to reapply patterns that you've learned. I mean, we talk about muscle memory, but there's not really
and
something like
learn completely new things
yeah,
and take in new information. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we're adventurers, right? We're explorers in this
yeah,
in this new age. And if we keep if we keep working on this, hopefully we'll be able to move civilization forward, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah. And
hey, carpe diem.
it made me think about a quote from the Tao Te Ching also, where Lao Tzu says that um, flexibility or uh, rigidity is in death,
Yes,
flexibility is in life. Um, the green reed will bend.
that's right.
The dead reed will break.
See, that
And I
was a
think,
callback to the tree thing I said at the beginning.
yeah, yeah. And our muscles is exactly the same. I mean, how do you build muscle? By
That's right.
tearing them. Yeah.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so maybe that's a good place to end the conversation because I promised people that I'll stick to an hour. Um, is if you want to survive, you have to be able to bend. Um, so
Yes. That's a wonderful place to stop. I love it.
so
It's
it
been
was
such a
wonderful
pleasure to
having this chat.
it's been
Just stay
absolutely
online.
thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Awesome. So I'm going to just quickly end off, but stay online. Okay, so remember, if you need to make or want to make contact with Erin, there's some contact details for her. Go to her LinkedIn profile, go and say hi. I hope you enjoyed the chat today as much as I did. Um, I think we need quite a few more of these, um, and it can be on the same topic. So thank you, Erin. And just before I'm going and finishing off, just a quick reminder: uh, a lot of my life lately is about digital transformation. New book, Innovate the Competition, is coming mid-May. Hope that you will enjoy that also. Thank you for joining us. For those who's listening to the show afterwards, nice having you. Keep in touch, stay in touch, make a difference, and bend.